The morning mist hung low between the crystal trees of the sacred grove, as Zephyra checked her spear one final time. The weapon hummed with stored energy from the ancient trees around her, its blue light casting dancing shadows on her pale skin. She knew this would be the last day she would see this place, one way or another. 3 cycles had passed since the harvesters first appeared in their system. The mechanical ships had swept through the outer colonies like death itself, turning living worlds into empty husks. Now only Kythera Prime remained, and even here they held only this small grove while the enemy gathered strength above. Zephyra's war band stood ready behind her, 12 warriors, each carrying spears blessed by their ancestors, each knowing they would not see another sunset. The energy weapons of the Velthari had proven effective against smaller harvester units, but the massive ship hovering in the sky was something else entirely. "They come," whispered Kalen, her second-in-command. His spear flickered with nervous energy as he pointed to the sky. The first wave descended like metal rain. Dozens of sleek machines dropped from the Reaper-class ship, their cutting beams already charging. Each harvester unit moved with perfect precision, their insectoid forms designed for one purpose: to strip away all organic matter and convert it into raw materials for their fleet. Zephyra raised her spear high. "For the grove, for our children, for the memory of all who came before." The battle cry echoed through the trees as 13 warriors charged forward to meet their doom. The first exchange was brutal. Zephyra's spear cut through 2 harvesters before they could react, her energy blade slicing through their armor like paper. Around her, her warriors fought with the grace of their people, their movements flowing like water as they danced between the enemy's cutting beams. But for every machine they destroyed, 2 more took its place. The harvesters had learned from previous encounters with the Velthari, their tactics adapted in real time, their formations shifting to counter each warrior's fighting style. Kalen fell first, his spear overloading as he tried to channel too much energy at once. The weapon exploded in his hands, taking 3 harvesters with him, but leaving a smoking crater where her oldest friend had stood. One by one, her warriors dropped. Thaisa lasted longer than most, her defensive techniques keeping her alive for precious minutes before a cutting beam found its mark. Jorik tried to reach the ancient power stones at the grove's heart, but never made it past the mechanical wall that rose to stop him. Soon only Zephyra remained, standing among the bodies of her people with her grandmother's spear clutched in trembling hands. The weapon had been in her family for 7 generations, its crystal core holding the concentrated life force of the grove itself. The remaining harvesters formed a circle around her, their mechanical eyes glowing red in the morning light. Above, the Reaper-class ship began its descent, ready to begin the final harvest. Zephyra closed her eyes and reached deep into the grove's power. The ancient trees responded, sending their life energy flowing through her spear until the weapon blazed like a miniature star. She opened her eyes and saw fear in the machines for the first time. She moved like lightning, her spear cutting great arcs of destruction through the harvester ranks. Energy cascaded from the weapon in waves, each strike destroying multiple targets. For a moment, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps one warrior with the right weapon could make a difference. Then she felt it. The first crack in the crystal core. The spear had served her family for generations, but it was not meant to channel this much power. The ancient crystal began to sing a high, keening note as stress fractures spread through its surface. Zephyra pushed harder, drawing more energy from the grove. She had to destroy enough harvesters to give the seed ships a chance to escape. Somewhere beneath the grove, the last children of her people waited in stasis, ready to carry their civilization to the stars if someone could buy them enough time. The spear's song grew louder, more desperate. More harvesters fell, their forms scattered like broken toys across the grove floor. But there were always more, and the crystal was failing. The final crack appeared right through the core's center. Zephyra felt the weapon's power bleeding away like water through a broken dam. She channeled everything she had left into one final strike, a blast of energy that vaporized a dozen machines at once. Then the spear shattered. The crystal core exploded in her hands, sending fragments of ancient power scattering across the grove. The weapon that had protected her family for 7 generations was gone, leaving her holding nothing but a metal staff. The surviving harvesters closed in, their cutting beams charging for the final strike. Zephyra stood straight, refusing to show fear even at the end. She would die as a warrior of the Velthari with honor and dignity, The machines raised their weapons. Time seemed to slow as she watched the beams begin to form. She thought of her grandmother, who had first taught her to use the spear. She thought of the children sleeping beneath the grove, depending on her sacrifice. Then something impossible happened. A streak of fire cut across the sky like a falling star. It struck the harvester formation with tremendous force, sending metal fragments flying in all directions. Smoke and flame erupted from the impact site as something crashed into the midst of her enemies. Through the smoke, Zephyra saw a figure rising from the wreckage. It wore strange armor marked with symbols she did not recognize, and it moved with purpose despite the damage to its equipment. The figure raised what looked like a primitive projectile weapon and began firing into the confused harvester ranks. The sound was unlike anything she had heard before. Harsh, mechanical barks that seemed crude compared to the elegant hum of energy weapons. But the results were undeniable. Harvesters fell under the strange weapon's fire, their armor pierced by simple metal projectiles. Zephyra stared in amazement as this unknown warrior fought with a style she had never seen. Where her people valued grace and precision, this fighter used raw aggression and unpredictable tactics. When its weapon ran dry, it threw small metal spheres that exploded among the enemy ranks. For the first time in 3 cycles, hope stirred in Zephyra's heart. She was no longer alone. The warrior moved like nothing Zephyra had ever seen. Where her people fought with flowing grace, this stranger used brutal efficiency. Its armor was scarred and smoking from the crash, but it showed no signs of slowing down. Jake Morrison checked his ammunition counter and cursed under his breath. The drop pod's emergency landing had damaged most of his equipment, and he was down to 3 magazines for his rifle. His universal translator was sparking and giving him nothing but static, so he had no idea what the tall, pale figure with the broken spear was saying. But he could read the situation well enough. Dead aliens scattered around a grove of strange trees, mechanical enemies regrouping for another attack, and one survivor who had clearly been fighting alone against impossible odds. It was the kind of mess that seemed to follow him everywhere. Jake pulled the pin from another frag grenade and tossed it into a cluster of the spider-like machines. The explosion sent metal fragments flying, taking out 3 of the units and damaging 2 more. These things were tough, but they seemed to have trouble adapting to his tactics. "Stay down," he shouted to the alien survivor, not expecting her to understand but hoping she would get the idea. Zephyra did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. This warrior was trying to protect her. She crawled behind the roots of a crystal tree and watched as the stranger continued his impossible fight. The human's weapons were crude, but effective. He used them in ways that made no sense to Zephyra's trained mind. Instead of seeking clean kills with precise strikes, he focused on causing chaos and confusion among the enemy ranks. When his projectile weapon was empty, he used it as a club. When that broke, he picked up pieces of destroyed harvesters and used them as weapons. Jake's combat training had never covered fighting mechanical aliens in an alien forest, but he fell back on basic principles. Keep moving, use cover, and never let the enemy predict your next move. The machines seemed to be learning his patterns, so he made sure to never repeat the same tactic twice. He spotted a damaged harvester trying to repair itself and sprinted toward it. The machine's cutting beam charged just as Jake slid under its chassis and drove his combat knife into what looked like a power coupling. The beam discharged harmlessly into the sky as the machine collapsed. More harvesters were descending from the ship above. Jake counted at least 20 new contacts, and he was almost out of ammunition. He needed to find better cover and figure out what made this place so important that someone would make a last stand here. Zephyra watched the human warrior's ammunition run low and made a decision. The sacred grove still held power even with the ancient spears destroyed. She could not wield it as a weapon anymore, but perhaps she could help in other ways. She began to sing, her voice carrying the old songs that called to the grove's energy. The crystal trees responded, their inner light growing brighter as power flowed through their branches. The harvesters, designed to harvest organic energy, were drawn to the increased output like moths to flame. Jake noticed the change immediately. The weird trees were glowing brighter, and the mechanical spiders were starting to move toward them instead of toward him. He did not understand what was happening, but he was not about to waste the opportunity. He set his last few grenades for delayed detonation and placed them along the path the machines were taking toward the trees. Then he found a position with good cover and waited. The trap worked perfectly. As the harvesters moved toward the energy-rich trees, they triggered Jake's explosives one by one. The confined space between the tree trunks turned the blast fragments into deadly shrapnel that tore through multiple targets with each explosion. But more machines kept coming. The massive ship above seemed to have an endless supply of harvesters, and Jake was down to his sidearm and combat knife. He needed a new strategy, and he needed it fast. Zephyra saw the human situation and tried to help by directing more energy to the trees closest to him. The crystal trunks began to pulse with stored power, creating a barrier that the harvester's cutting beams could not penetrate. Jake noticed the trees around him were getting brighter, and somehow stopping the enemy's energy weapons. He did not understand the science, but he understood the tactical advantage. He moved from tree to tree, using them as mobile cover while he picked off individual harvesters with his sidearm. The alien who had been singing had stopped and was gesturing toward something deeper in the grove. Jake followed her line of sight and saw what looked like a control panel or altar, made of the same crystal material as the trees. Zephyra was trying to tell him about the grove's heart, where the ancient power stones stored energy for the entire forest. If they could reach it, perhaps they could find a way to amplify the defensive barrier, or even turn the grove's power into a weapon. Jake understood the gesture, if not the words. The alien woman wanted him to follow her deeper into the forest. It could be a trap, but she had been helping him fight the machines. Sometimes you had to trust your gut. He provided covering fire while Zephyra led him toward the grove's center. The harvesters followed, their formation adapting to the new terrain as they moved between the crystal trees. The heart of the grove was a circular clearing dominated by a ring of massive crystal formations. Power flowed between them in visible streams of blue-white energy, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. At the center stood a single tree, larger than all the others, its trunk pulsing with concentrated life force. Zephyra placed her hands on the central crystal and began another song. The entire grove responded, its energy output increasing dramatically. The harvesters that had followed them into the clearing sparked and stuttered as their systems overloaded from the electromagnetic interference. Jake saw his chance and opened fire on the disabled machines. His sidearm's bullets punched through their armor easily while their systems were compromised. In seconds, the immediate threat was eliminated, but the victory was temporary. Through the crystal trees, Jake could see more harvesters massing for another assault. Worse, the big ship above was starting to descend. Whatever these machines wanted from this place, they were done playing games. Zephyra turned to face him, her alien features marked by exhaustion and desperation. She spoke in her own language, her tone urgent and pleading. Jake wished his translator was working, but her meaning was clear enough. They were running out of time. The real fight was about to begin, and neither of them was equipped to handle what was coming. But sometimes Jake reflected as he checked his remaining ammunition. The only choice was to keep fighting until you could not fight anymore. At least this time, he would not be fighting alone. The dawn came with fire from the sky. The Harvester Reaper-class ship hung low over the sacred grove, its cutting beams carving great scars through the crystal trees. Each blast sent fragments of ancient wood and crystal flying through the air like deadly rain. Jake crouched behind the central tree's massive trunk, watching the bombardment pattern through his rifle scope. The enemy was being systematic, clearing the grove from outside to center. They had maybe 10 minutes before the beams reached their position. Zephyra pressed her hands against the great tree's bark, feeling the energy building within its crystalline core. The grove was responding to the attack by drawing power from deep underground, preparing for one final surge. She could sense the seed ships far below, their systems still dormant but ready to awaken. Now or never, Jake muttered, checking his demolition charges one last time. He had rigged them according to Zephyra's instructions, placing each explosive at specific points where the energy flow was strongest. The alien woman's understanding of the grove's power network was incredible, far beyond anything human science could have achieved. The cutting beams moved closer, each blast taking down another ancient tree. The harvesters were patient and thorough, making sure nothing survived their advance. Above them, the massive ship began to extend its harvesting arms, mechanical appendages designed to strip away every trace of organic matter. Zephyra felt each tree's death like a physical blow. These giants had stood for thousands of years, sheltering her people and storing the wisdom of countless generations. Now they fell one by one, their life force bleeding away into the scorched earth. But their sacrifice was not meaningless. Each destroyed tree released its stored energy into the grove's network, channeling power toward the central trunk where Jake's explosives waited. The ancient safeguards built into the grove were responding exactly as her ancestors had designed them to. "The shields," Zephyra said, pointing upward with trembling fingers. Her translator was working better now, catching more of her words. "They lower shields for harvest beams," Jake nodded grimly. "The harvester ship would have to drop its defensive screens to deploy the organic extraction systems. For a few precious seconds, the massive vessel would be vulnerable to energy-based attacks. That was their window. Ground units began dropping from the ship's belly, dozens of spider-like harvesters descending on anti-gravity platforms. They moved in perfect formation, their cutting beams already charging as they prepared to finish what the orbital bombardment had started. Jake opened fire with his sidearm, picking off the lead units as they landed. His bullets found their marks, but there were too many targets and not enough ammunition. He switched to his last grenade, tossing it into the middle of the formation. The explosion scattered the harvesters but did not stop them. They adapted quickly, spreading out to minimize the damage from area weapons. Their tactical programming was learning from each attack, making them harder to surprise. Zephyra sang the old war songs, calling upon the grove's remaining power. The surviving trees responded, their crystal branches glowing brighter as energy flowed between them. Several harvesters that came too close sparked and fell as their systems overloaded, but the defense was failing. There were simply too many enemies and the grove's power was nearly exhausted. Jake's ammunition ran out, forcing him to rely on his combat knife against machines designed to tear apart organic matter. Above them, the Reaper-class ship's harvesting arms extended fully. Massive energy projectors emerged from the ship's underside, preparing to strip away everything in the grove down to the molecular level. The orbital bombardment ceased as the vessel prepared for the final extraction. "Shields down," Zephyra gasped, feeling the change in the energy patterns above. The ship's defensive screens had collapsed, leaving it vulnerable for the few seconds it would take to complete the harvest. Jake triggered the first demolition charge. The explosion sent a shockwave through the grove's root network, forcing stored energy toward the central tree. The ancient trunk began to glow with accumulated power, its crystal veins blazing like captured lightning. The second charge detonated, then the third. Each explosion channeled more energy into the massive tree until it blazed like a miniature sun. The power buildup was beyond anything the grove had ever contained, straining the ancient crystal matrix to its breaking point. Zephyra placed both hands on the tree's glowing surface and opened herself to its power. Energy flowed through her like liquid fire, burning away everything that made her merely mortal. She became a conduit for forces that had slept beneath the grove for millennia. The central tree's trunk cracked, unable to contain the massive power surge. Energy began to leak out in brilliant streams, seeking the path of least resistance toward the seed ships buried far below. But the flow was chaotic, unfocused. Without proper direction, it would dissipate harmlessly into the ground. Jake saw what was happening and made his choice. He grabbed Zephyra's hands where they touched the tree, adding his own body to the circuit. The energy flowed through him like molten metal, every nerve screaming in agony as alien forces rewrote his cellular structure. Together they became the focusing lens the grove needed. Human determination and Velthari knowledge combined to channel the energy surge into a coherent beam. The power flowed down through the root network, racing toward the dormant seed ships far below. Underground, ancient systems came to life. The seed ships' emergency beacons activated, sending distress calls across the galaxy. Their engines began warming up, preparing to carry 300 sleeping children to safety among the stars. The first phase of their plan had worked, but the energy surge was too much for mortal beings to contain. Jake felt his armor's systems failing as power overloaded every circuit. Zephyra's crystal-pale skin began to crack like overstressed glass as forces beyond her people's normal limits flowed through her body. The harvester ship above them began its extraction sequence, unaware that its prey had become something far more dangerous. Massive energy beams lanced down from the vessel's harvesting arrays, designed to strip away every trace of organic matter in seconds. Instead, they struck the grove just as Jake and Zephyra released the accumulated power in one tremendous surge. The energy that had been meant to save the seed ships redirected upward, following the harvesting beams back to their source like lightning striking in reverse. The Reaper-class ship's shields were down, its armor configured for harvesting rather than combat. The energy lance punched through its hull like tissue paper, overloading power systems and igniting fuel stores. Secondary explosions rippled along the vessel's length as critical systems failed in cascade. Jake and Zephyra were thrown backward by the energy backlash, their bodies smoking from forces no living being was meant to channel. The central tree exploded in a shower of crystal fragments, its ancient trunk finally succumbing to the power it had contained. Above them, the harvester ship listed heavily as its anti-grav systems failed. Internal explosions lit up the vessel's hull like a deadly fireworks display. The massive ship began falling toward the planet's surface, its crew of mechanical minds unable to comprehend what had just destroyed them. The grove was dying around them, its crystal trees cracking and falling as their power network collapsed. But far below, the seed ships were powering up their engines, preparing to carry the next generation of Velthari to safety among the stars. Jake tried to speak but found his voice gone, his throat burned by energies never meant for human tissue. Beside him, Zephyra's breathing was shallow and rapid, her crystal-pale skin now marked with fracture lines that glowed with residual power. They had won, but the victory might cost them everything. As consciousness faded, Jake's last thought was that 300 children would live to see tomorrow. It was enough. Night fell over the sacred grove, bringing with it an uneasy quiet. The harvesters had pulled back to regroup, but Jake knew they would return with the dawn. He sat with his back against one of the crystal trees, trying to make sense of his situation while his alien companion worked on something at the grove's heart. Jake's translator finally sparked back to life, though it only caught fragments of what the woman was saying. Her name seemed to be Zephyra, and she kept mentioning something about children and ships. The broken words made little sense, but her tone suggested she was explaining something important. Zephyra had been trying to communicate for hours, using gestures and broken phrases to tell the strange warrior about her people's situation. She pointed to the ground beneath the grove, where the seed ships waited in their hidden chambers. Inside those vessels, 300 Velthari children slept in stasis pods, waiting for someone to activate their escape sequence. Jake caught enough words to understand that something valuable was hidden beneath the grove, something worth protecting. Children, maybe. Ships. The pieces started to form a picture in his mind. This was not just a last stand, it was a rescue mission. He pulled out his emergency beacon and showed it to Zephyra. The device was damaged but still functional, its display showing that his backup fleet was 3 days away at best. By then, it would be too late for whatever was hidden in this place. Zephyra examined the human device with fascination. Her people had similar technology, but this machine was built with a completely different approach. Where Velthari technology relied on energy manipulation and organic interfaces, this device used crude but reliable electronic systems. She tried to explain about the seed ship's communication array, using hand gestures to show how the underground vessels could call for help if they were activated. But the grove's power was failing after the day's battle, and without the ancient spears to focus the energy, she could not reach the buried controls. Jake studied the alien woman's gestures and began to understand. There were ships underground, probably escape vessels for refugees. They needed power to launch or to call for help, but the local power source was damaged. It was exactly the kind of desperate situation he had trained for. He pulled out his demolition kit and showed Zephyra the shaped charges inside. Military-grade explosives designed to breach fortified positions or destroy enemy equipment. With the right application, they could also be used to redirect energy or create focused electromagnetic pulses. Zephyra looked at the crude chemical explosives with new respect. Her people had always viewed such weapons as primitive and wasteful, but she was beginning to see their potential. The humans' approach to problem-solving was completely different from anything she had encountered. Working together despite the language barrier, they began to plan. Zephyra showed Jake how the grove's energy flowed through the crystal trees, and Jake explained how his explosives could be used to redirect that flow. It was dangerous and would probably destroy the grove, but it might give the seed ships enough power to activate their communication systems. Jake learned that Zephyra's people had been fighting the harvesters for cycles, their energy weapons proving effective against smaller units. But the mechanical army always returned with new adaptations, and eventually every world fell. The seed ships represented the last hope for the Velthari civilization. Zephyra discovered that Jake's people had only recently encountered the Harvester threat. Instead of retreating or trying to negotiate, humans had immediately begun launching rescue missions to save other species. Jake's ship had been the third human vessel lost in such attempts, and he was the only survivor. The revelation that humans were risking their lives to save complete strangers affected Zephyra deeply. Her people valued honor and duty, but this concept of helping others without expectation of reward was something new. She began to understand why this warrior fought with such desperate courage. Jake explained through gestures and broken words that his people believed in helping those who could not help themselves. It was not a matter of strategy or politics, just simple human nature. When someone needed help, you helped them. When children were in danger, you protected them. As the night wore on, they refined their plan. The grove's central tree contained the most concentrated energy, enough to power the seed ships if it could be properly channeled. Jake's explosives could create a directed blast that would force all that energy into the underground chambers. But the timing would have to be perfect. The plan would require them to wait until the Harvester fleet was in position for the final assault. The enemy ships would lower their shields to deploy ground forces, creating a brief window where a massive energy pulse could damage or destroy them. But activating the seed ships would drain the grove completely, leaving them defenseless. Zephyra accepted the risks without hesitation. The children's lives were more important than her own, and this strange human warrior seemed to understand that without needing explanation. She had found an ally who shared her people's deepest values while fighting in a completely different way. Jake checked his remaining equipment one final time. 3 shaped charges, a half-empty magazine for his sidearm and his combat knife. Not much to face an entire alien fleet, but he had worked with less before. The key was timing and making every shot count. Zephyra sang softly to the grove, preparing the ancient trees for what was to come. The crystal formations pulsed in response to her voice, storing energy for the final gambit. She thought of her grandmother, who had taught her that sometimes the greatest victory required the greatest sacrifice. As dawn approached, they took their positions near the grove's heart. The Harvester fleet was already moving, the massive Reaper-class ship descending through the atmosphere with dozens of smaller vessels in formation around it. Soon the final battle would begin. Jake watched the enemy ships approach and felt the familiar calm that came before combat. He had volunteered for this mission knowing he probably would not survive it. The fact that he might save an entire species made the sacrifice worthwhile. Zephyra stood beside him, her broken spear replaced with a simple crystal knife. She had been trained as a warrior, but now she would fight as something more, a protector of her people's future. The human beside her had shown her that courage came in many forms. The first cutting beams began to fall from the sky, targeting the grove's outer edges. The final assault had begun, and with it, their last chance to give the Velthari children a future among the stars. Neither Jake nor Zephyra expected to survive the next hour, but they faced the approaching doom with determination. They had found each other in the darkest moment, and together they would make their last stand count. 3 days later, the ships came. Jake drifted in and out of consciousness, his body kept alive by some kind of medical field that hummed with alien energy. Through blurred vision, he could see Zephyra nearby, her crystal-pale form wrapped in similar treatment devices. They were both alive somehow, though he was not sure how. The rescue fleet had arrived exactly when his emergency beacon predicted. The UNS Liberty led a small task force of human vessels, their crews responding to the distress signals from both Jake's beacon and the Velthari seed ships below. But they had not come alone. Captain Lisa Hayes stood in the makeshift medical bay studying reports from both human and Velthari sources. The alien vessels that had responded to the seed ship distress calls were elegant things, their hulls shaped like crystalline flowers. Their crews moved with the same flowing grace as the warrior woman who lay unconscious in the medical field. Status report, Hayes requested from her medical officer. Both subjects should be dead, Dr. Carl Brown replied bluntly. The energy readings from their bodies are off the charts. Something fundamentally changed their cellular structure during the battle. They're alive, but they're not quite the same species they were before. Hayes nodded grimly. The wreckage of the Harvester Reaper-class ship told its own story. The massive vessel had been destroyed by some kind of directed energy weapon far beyond current human technology. Yet the only survivors were one Marine with basic equipment and an alien warrior with a broken spear. Elder Thessarian of the Velthari rescue fleet approached the human captain with measured steps. The alien leader was tall and elegant like all his people, but his crystal-pale features showed deep concern. "The Grovekeeper lives," he said in accented but clear English. His translator was far superior to the damaged unit Jake had carried. "This is beyond all hope. We thought her lost with the Sacred Grove." "Grovekeeper?" Hayes asked. Zephyra held the rank of war leader, but her actions have earned her a greater title. She preserved the seed ships and their precious cargo. 300 of our young ones live because of her sacrifice. The elder paused, studying Jake's unconscious form. "And because of your warrior's sacrifice as well. We did not know humans existed until your ships arrived, yet this one gave his life for our children without hesitation." Hayes felt a surge of pride in her Marine, even as she worried about his condition. It was exactly the kind of impossible heroics that Jake specialized in. "Will they recover?" Dr. Brown checked his readings again. "Their vital signs are stabilizing, but the energy bonding process changed them permanently. They seem to be developing some kind of shared connection, probably from channeling that power surge together." As if summoned by his words, both patients began to stir. Jake's eyes opened first, immediately seeking Zephyra across the medical bay. She woke moments later, her alien features showing the same concern for his welfare. "The children," Zephyra whispered, her voice hoarse but determined. "Safe," Elder Thessarian assured her. "All 300 seed ships have successfully launched. They carry our genetic heritage and cultural knowledge to worlds beyond the Harvester reach. Your mission was successful." Jake tried to sit up, wincing as every muscle protested. "My ship, my crew." Captain Hayes moved to his bedside. "The Defiance was lost with all hands, Marine. I'm sorry, but your sacrifice wasn't meaningless. The intelligence we've gathered from this operation will help us fight the Harvesters more effectively." Over the following hours, both crews began to understand what they had discovered. The Velthari possessed energy manipulation technology that could revolutionize human defensive capabilities. Humans brought tactical unpredictability and weapons technology that could complement the aliens' more elegant approaches. More importantly, they had found kindred spirits. Both species valued protecting those who could not protect themselves. Both were willing to sacrifice for future generations. The foundation for an alliance was already in place. 6 months later, Jake stood on the observation deck of the UNS Harmony, humanity's first ship built with Velthari energy technology. The vessel hummed with power drawn from crystalline cores similar to those that had once grown in the Sacred Grove. But these crystals were cultivated rather than ancient, grown specifically to power the hybrid ship. Zephyra joined him at the viewport, her movements still marked by the flowing grace of her people. The energy bonding they had experienced during the battle had left them permanently linked, able to sense each other's emotions and share thoughts when needed. It was not uncomfortable, merely different. "The children adapt well," she observed, watching the ship's observation lounge. Human and Velthari children played together in the recreational area, their games mixing the best of both cultures. The young ones had no trouble accepting their differences, finding common ground in curiosity and wonder. They represented the future both species were working toward. "Your people keep their promises," Zephyra continued. "The colony worlds are well protected," Jake nodded. The joint human-Velthari task forces had proven remarkably effective against Harvester incursions. Human unpredictability combined with Velthari energy weapons created tactical approaches the mechanical enemies could not counter easily. "We learned from each other," he replied. "Your technology, our tactics. Their technology, our stubbornness." Zephyra smiled, an expression her people rarely showed to outsiders. But Jake was no longer an outsider, not after what they had shared. Sometimes the best weapon is not knowing when to surrender. Through the viewport they could see the stars stretching endlessly in all directions. Somewhere in that vastness, other species were fighting their own desperate battles against the Harvester fleets, but they were no longer fighting alone. The rescue missions continued now with mixed crews and hybrid technology. Human determination combined with Velthari wisdom was proving effective at saving refugees from a dozen different species. Each successful mission added new knowledge and new allies to their growing coalition. Jake thought about the sacred grove that had brought them together. Now nothing but scorched earth on a distant world. But its sacrifice had planted seeds across the galaxy, growing into something stronger than any single species could have achieved alone. No regrets? Zephyra asked quietly. Jake considered the question seriously. He had lost his ship, his crew, and his purely human nature in that battle, but he had gained something as well. Purpose, partnership, and the knowledge that hope could survive even the darkest circumstances. None, he said finally. Sometimes breaking apart is just the first step toward becoming something better. They stood together in comfortable silence. Human and Velthari, warrior and grovekeeper, watching the stars and planning their next mission. Behind them, the children of two worlds played and learned and grew, carrying the best of both cultures toward an uncertain but hopeful future. The Harvesters still ruled much of the galaxy, but they no longer faced scattered, isolated resistance. The alliance was growing stronger with each world they saved, each species they brought into the coalition. What had begun with one human diving from the sky to help a stranger was becoming something that might just save the galaxy. Zephyra's spear had shattered, but from its destruction had grown something far more powerful than any weapon. Unity, hope, and the unshakable belief that no one should face the darkness alone.